Emily, thank you for that lovely introduction. Really wonderful. The only thing I have to say about that introduction is the book is so expensive in hardcover that I have to recommend that you either get it on Kindle from Amazon or as a PDF or EPUB from Anthem. But anyway, it's really... Or borrow it from the library. You can look at them today, but don't take those copies. They're still in process. So what I wanted to do today was start by explaining these three terms that make up the title of the book: cultural and processes and inequality. Different academic disciplines, of course, define culture differently, and I'm actually going to say what I mean by it in the way that I talk about it in the book. By culture, I simply mean shared understandings, those ideas, beliefs, and values that we hold in common, the shared assumptions underlying them, and the norms, rules, and laws that emerge from those shared understandings. So that's quite broad, but I think as I go through the talk, you'll see a range of examples of what that looks like in real life. By processes, I basically mean patterned actions that repeat over time and that lead to certain kinds of outcomes. And the outcomes we're talking about today have to do with systemic inequality. In the book, I focus on anti-Black racism, sexism, and heterosexism in the US. However, what I think is wonderful about the impulse behind this book and some of the ideas that I share in it, most of which I got from other sociologists and thinkers, these ideas can be applied to absolutely any form of inequality. So if your interest is Islamophobia or anti-Semitism, ageism, ableism, pretty much any form that works in this way, the ideas in this book can translate to those other kinds of categories. So I'm going to get us started with a quote from one of my favorite sociologists of inequality, Michael Schwab, who writes, "Inequality is not the result of mysterious forces. We can see how resources are transmitted in families, how skills and self-confidence are nurtured or not in schools, how people gain access to or are excluded from the networks through which information and opportunities are obtained, how gatekeepers and bosses make decisions about employees, how rules of the game are made, interpreted, and enforced. Behind every unequal outcome, there is a process that can be analyzed by answering how questions. If we understand these processes, we are in a better position to try to change them." The scope of the book is broader than what I'm going to cover today, but I did want to give you a sense of what was in it. I start with a chapter that sets up inequality as what I consider differential valuation. So some people matter more than others, and in unequal societies, you matter more if you're part of a socially valued group. You matter less if you're part of a socially devalued group. Many of us are members of both kinds of groups, and so how much we matter will kind of depend on the context. I then have a chapter on power and systemic inequality, looking at decision-making power in institutional contexts, cultural power, and the kind of individual power that we think of in terms of, say, credibility. Then I get into kind of the meat of the argument of the book, where I set up the concept of the benefit of the doubt. And then there are several chapters that cover concrete examples of these processes: moral alchemy, false equivalencies, self-fulfilling prophecies, the ways that visibility and invisibility can work positively or negatively depending on what kind of group you're in, and then the way that people are thought of as problems or as having problems, and that one little difference turns out to be very important in people's life chances. Then there's a pretty large chapter that brings the processes together with large-scale examples. So, for example, sexual assault and rape myths is covered there, women's experiences of pain and why that's not taken seriously, the racialization of crime and the criminalization of African American people, and so on. There's a short chapter on collusion, that awkward reality that sometimes those of us in devalued and oppressed groups contribute to or participate in our own oppression, and I talk a little bit about that. And finally, the conclusion toward a good faith society. Now that we know these things, what are we going to do about them? How can we take this knowledge, these cultural processes, and begin to change our own understandings, our own actions individually, systemically, and so on. Finally, there's an appendix for people who have not taken a sociology class before to kind of introduce sociology and some of the, I think, more important insights that sociologists can bring to these conversations. I'm obviously not going to try to cover all of that today, though. I'm going to start with a contextual piece about the concept of moral exclusion, and then describe a bit what I mean by the benefit of the doubt, and then we're going to focus on these four areas that are covered in some of the chapters: moral alchemy, false equivalencies, self-fulfilling prophecies, and the relationship between problems and people. Moral exclusion comes to us from social psychology, specifically the social psychologist Susan Opitow, and I find it an incredibly powerful and reorienting concept. Opitow writes, "Moral exclusion occurs when individuals or groups are perceived as outside the boundary within which moral values, rules, and considerations of fairness apply. Those who are morally excluded are perceived as non-entities, expendable, or undeserving. Consequently, harming them or exploiting them appears to be appropriate, acceptable, or just." If you think back to the Dred Scott U.S. Supreme Court decision from 1857, the court ruled that people legally classified as black had, quote, "no rights a white man must respect." Now, if we think about the Founding Fathers, there is this language in the early history of our country about all people having certain inalienable rights. And so, for me, the Dred Scott decision, A, is unfortunately a beautiful example of moral exclusion. B, it suggests that the court did not even really see black people as people, because if all people have certain inalienable rights, but black people have no rights a white man must respect, and again, I'm using language more of the time, that raises some questions about the court's understanding of their humanity, which is quite horrifying. But on a practical level, this decision also means that white people had just complete freedom to cause any kind of harm, mischief, menace, oppression to people legally classified as black, and those being harmed had no redress. White people would never be held accountable. There were no systems in place for justice or fairness or anything. So that is a stunning early example of moral exclusion in our society, one of many. Much more recently, while working on this book, I ran into a newspaper article that covered a letter that had been written to an editor by a member of a parent group that was suing a school, I want to say in Virginia perhaps, over a curriculum teaching kindness and compassion. And yes, this parent group was suing to get rid of the kindness and compassion curriculum because, and this was literally in the letter to the editor that this woman wrote, "Not every human being is deserving of my child's empathy." I cannot imagine a better example of moral exclusion than that. But I will give you one more personal example. As we all know, Colorado Springs is quite a libertarian town. We care tremendously about private property here, and yet somehow some people's private property is inviolable and must be left alone, but other people's private property can be defaced or stolen or what have you. So I can't count the number of bumper stickers on my car that have been defaced or ripped off. I can't count the number of political yard signs we've had stolen at one time or another. And interestingly, this isn't just a personal matter. The church I go to flies Black Lives Matter and Pride flags, and they are routinely stolen, defaced, desecrated, and so on. And so why is this? Are the conservatives of Colorado Springs just hypocrites? I don't think so. I don't think this is hypocrisy. I actually think that I and my church have been morally excluded from the community of people whose private property rights are inviolable. I literally think that when someone sees my progressive bumper stickers, they decide that I am outside of the community of those whose private property must be left alone, and therefore it's fine to attack. And because my church has Black Lives Matter and Pride flags, despite religion being quite important in Colorado Springs, apparently it depends what kind of religion it is. So as I said before, I think this concept of moral exclusion is absolutely key to understanding inequality. I'd love to say more about that in the Q&A if anyone finds that of interest. But now I want to move on to the central concept of the book. Now, probably many of us have used the phrase the benefit of the doubt casually in one way or another in our lives, and we don't normally think of it as a theoretical concept, and yet I think it can do some pretty interesting heavy lifting here if we think about it in terms of groups of people being systematically either granted the benefit of the doubt or having the benefit of the doubt systematically withheld from them. And by the benefit of the doubt, I'm really thinking about good faith or bad faith assumptions. So expecting the best from someone or expecting the worst from someone when you don't know anything about them. So all you're going off are stereotypes. And so you don't have any evidence about what someone is like, about how competent or moral or dangerous or smart or kind or anything they are, but you have stereotyped them because of some social group they belong to, and you then either expect the best of them because they belong to a valued social group, or you expect the worst of them because they belong to a devalued group. I've put up a bunch of positive and negative assumptions here. When I have tried to kind of sift through the extremely extensive literature on systemic inequality in sociology, in psychology, in anthropology, in political science, and so on, what I find is that these assumptions, the ones on the screen, come up over and over and over again. They seem to inform a lot of the way that people are treated well or badly. So positive assumptions, we think that certain people are probably competent, are probably successful, likely to be intelligent, likely to be hardworking, trustworthy, moral, and so on. Most of these assumptions are what you would call descriptive assumptions. That is, they describe what a person is like. But the last two, being worthy of respect and being worthy of positive treatment, are kind of evaluative assumptions. So they bring a kind of morality into it. Then, of course, we have all the negative assumptions, which are kind of the reverse of the positive ones. And as you look at this list, think about racism, sexism, and heterosexism especially. Who is considered competent and who is considered incompetent? Who do we expect to be successful or a failure? Who do we think is likely to be smart or less smart? Who is probably trustworthy? Who is probably untrustworthy? Who is immoral just by definition? Standing up here as a queer person. Here's a couple that I find interesting. So irrationality. We don't tend to think of men as irrational. It's not part of the stereotype. But boy, the word hysterical is used to describe women who are anything other than very, very quiet and calm. And God forbid you should actually be an angry woman, you know. On anger there too, what about the whole idea of the angry black man or the angry black woman? Honestly, if I had to face that kind of racism, I'd be angry all the time. And yet, we somehow have anger here serving as problematic depending on who expresses it. The idea of appropriate self-interest, this is an individualistic society and we're all thought to have some self-interests that are reasonable, but only certain groups are thought to be asking for special rights or special privileges or entitlements. So when you hear that language, you have to ask, why is that language being used for them but not other people? In fact, we can think of systemic discrimination as a kind of institutional bad faith treatment in which these bad faith negative assumptions turn into bad faith poor treatment. I'm going to give you two quick stories. Both of these are in the book. One of them is a story about a novelist in Boston, Catherine Nichols. With the support of her accomplished writer friends, Nichols sent cover letters in the beginning of her first novel to 50 literary agents, receiving only rejections. 2 of the 50 agents were willing to review the full manuscript, but would not guarantee that they would represent her. On a hunch, she sent the same materials to a whole bunch of other agents and made one change. She changed her name. She sent them as George instead of as Catherine. I'm sure you can imagine what happens next, but here it is. She sent off the first submission as George, and before she'd even drafted the second, she received a reply saying, "Delighted, excited, please send the manuscript." To the 6 queries she sent on the first day, she received 5 instant replies, 3 asked for the manuscript, and 2 were warm rejections, praising George's exciting project. So she went on and decided to do a 50-50 comparison. So literally she approached 50 agents, under the male name as she had approached 50 under the female name. And originally, she had gotten 2 maybes. She got 17 yeses from the 50 agents who she sent to as a man. Same materials, same beginning of the book. In fact, one agent who had rejected her as Catherine not only asked to read George's book, but sent it to a senior colleague. So there's one example. Here's another one. Racism in the Baltimore home appraisal system. 2021, a home appraisal came back too low, and so the owners were denied a refinancing loan. The family in question was black. On a hunch again, they took all of the black artwork and photographs out of their house, replaced them with white photographs and artwork that white people might have. I would love to know the details of that, but unfortunately the story does not tell us. And one of the husband's white colleagues pretended to be the homeowner, and they had another appraiser come. So, just to be really clear, the neighborhood had not changed, the property had not changed, the value of the house had not changed. All they did was change the appraiser's expectation of who lived there. The initial appraisal was $472,000. The new appraisal was $750,000. I bet, as you can guess, they got their loan. But what a bittersweet way to have that happen, huh? So the book covers in great detail racism and sexism in hiring, racism and heterosexism in the housing market in various parts of it, and quite extensively, racism across the criminal justice system. There are endless examples I could give you, but if you do read the book, you'll see some of them, and there's a ton of literature on this. So now I want to get into some of the more specific kinds of processes. I mentioned moral alchemy before. We have this concept thanks to the sociologist Robert Merton, and the definition of it is basically the same behavior is viewed positively when members of a valued group do it, and is viewed negatively when members of a devalued group do it. Obviously, in these election days, as we contemplate gender and leadership, gendered language double standards pop up and seem quite interesting. So if you think about things one might say about a male supervisor, one might say that the male supervisor is assertive, but a woman supervisor acting in exactly the same way is more likely to be called bossy. Now, how interesting, because she actually is a boss, and yet bossy is not a positive term in this concept. Similarly, where he's passionate, she's emotional. Emotional, again, that sounds irrational. That sounds kind of problematic. Where he's firm and well-grounded in his principles, she's stubborn, which sounds unreasonable. He's good at details, but she's picky. That sort of evokes nitpickiness, which sort of suggests being a little obsessive. Again, kind of psychologically questionable there. And then, my favorite here, there's a whole range of terms where he's powerful, she is abrasive, strident, shrill, controlling, pushy, bitchy. Clearly, the behavior is not the issue here. It's who is engaging in the behavior and what is expected of members of that social group. A couple of other examples. Marriage. Great for heterosexuals, according to pretty much every conservative I've ever met or read from, but not so good for same-sex couples. In fact, they're trying to overturn our marriage rights. So it's good for them, it's not good for us. Affirmative action is fine if it helps white men, and we have a whole history in the US of this. Any historians in the room, I'm thinking about the Naturalization Act, the Wagner Act, the GI Bill, over and over and over again, we have had policies that have helped white people, especially white men, get ahead. But that's not called affirmative action. It's only called affirmative action when it helps women or members of BIPOC communities, and there it's a problem. Similarly, the court recently, Supreme Court, ruled against affirmative action, but said nothing whatsoever about legacy admissions in that ruling. And yet, though there were some debates about this, legacy admissions arguably are a kind of affirmative action. They tend to benefit rich white people, especially rich white males. So we can argue about that later. Nonetheless, it is an interesting lacuna in the ruling. Finally, I wish this were funny, the governor of Tennessee, Bill Lee, who signed a bill banning certain kinds of drag activities and events in Tennessee a couple of years ago, it was discovered that he had done drag in college, and there were photos to prove it. And when this surfaced, his press office went into overdrive, explaining that what he had done was part of a quote-unquote lighthearted school tradition, not the quote-unquote obscene sexualized entertainment that actual drag queens were doing. So again, same behavior, differently valued people. I've put in or more recently here, but I'm not going to go on with that. You all know who I'm talking about, I hope. If you don't, ask me later. All right. False equivalencies are the opposite of moral alchemy. They are situations in which two groups really have different experiences, or two situations really are different, and yet they are treated as equivalent when they aren't. There's a famous quote about this from a 1910, I think it's a novel. "The law in its majestic equality forbids rich and poor alike to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, and to steal their bread." Well, I mean, that is wonderfully egalitarian, but of course, to be obvious, rich people don't need to sleep under bridges, rich people don't need to beg in the streets, and rich people don't need to steal. Whether rich people steal is a whole other conversation. We'll have another time. But you can see the point here. So when we treat two groups or two situations as equivalent and they aren't, especially when they aren't because of reasons of inequality, we have a false equivalency. In the book, I talk at length about the Blue Lives Matter movement and its attempt to compare itself to the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, in saying that, I'm not making any particular comments about policing and the goods or bads or history of it or what it could be used for, and I'm not trying to denigrate individual police officers. What I'm talking about is this particular strategy that clearly is intending to set police officers up as equivalent to black people. There's a ton of problems, and you can read about them in the book, but I'll mention a few quickly. First, some police officers are black, so this is kind of a problematic dichotomy. And we know two things about black police officers. One, they face tremendous racism from their fellow officers who are white. Two, I'm sorry to say this, but black police officers are perfectly capable of harming, oppressing, and killing black people who are not police officers, as we well know. So that's a complication already. But to be really obvious about it, police officers do not have a history in the US of having been enslaved, facing Jim Crow laws, themselves being mass incarcerated for the sheer crime of being police officers. That sounds ridiculous even as I say it. And again, just one other one. If a police officer takes off their uniform, the odds are that someone who has never met them before will not identify them as a police officer, and therefore probably will not treat them one way or another related to their police officer status. Whereas it's pretty hard to change your skin color, and anyone who looks at you and sees a darker skinned person and has been taught to be racist, which everyone in our society has been, including me, that person cannot just stop being black for the day, or stop being African American for the day, or biracial, or whatever they might be. And so Blue Lives Matter is much more equivalent to Nurse Lives Matter, or English Professor Lives Matter, or Director of Assessment and Program Review Lives Matter. Really, we do, our lives matter. I'm going to skip the last example here in the interest of time, but we certainly could talk about that if we wanted to. We move on to the last category, kind of connected to assumptions in this way, the idea of self-fulfilling prophecies. We also get this from Robert Merton, who was just a tremendous blessing to sociology 80 years ago. Self-fulfilling prophecies are incorrect assumptions or beliefs that lead to actions that change reality in such ways that the initially incorrect assumptions or beliefs actually become true because reality has changed. Merton's example, and I love this example, is imagine a bank that is perfectly solvent, its money is fine, but for whatever reason you have come to believe, and you bank there, you've come to believe, as have the other people who bank there, that they are facing financial problems. What are you going to do? You're probably going to withdraw your money. I would withdraw mine, of course. But as a result, if enough people withdraw their money, what happens? The bank becomes insolvent. So a wrong assumption led to a set of actions that led to a change of status that made the wrong assumption become a correct assumption. So in that sense, self-fulfilling prophecies are a way that our ideas can change reality. Now, they can be used for the good, but they're often used for the bad. Just a couple of examples related to inequality. Since we are here at a college, I would be remiss not to start with racism and sexism in the classroom. If we have been taught that white people and men are smarter and more intellectually engaged and more committed to learning and so on than members of BIPOC communities or than women, we as teachers and professors in the classroom will teach to the people we think we're going to have the most impact on. Now, we can learn other ways of doing this. Again, that's a conversation we can have later. But if we are not thinking about these issues, our impulse is going to be to teach in ways that involves giving more attention, more patience, more time, more second chances, more warm smiles. I mean, honestly, there's a literature on this, and it's astonishing. Literally, the way that teachers make differential eye contact with people based on race and gender is astonishing. So now, imagine that you are a student in that class, and whatever your personal set of identities, imagine that you are a woman or a member of the BIPOC community, and you see what's going on, and you see that teacher or that professor not treating you as well as they are treating that other person. And lest you think that this is purely theoretical or that I'm working strictly off of literature, I will tell you that when I was still working as a college professor at a pretty fancy school that is more highly ranked than Colorado College 20 years ago and a couple, I once gave a lecture in an introductory sociology class on sexism and the ways that professors tend to call on men more than women in classrooms. I swear to God, I gave this lecture. And then we had a class discussion, and two women stayed after class to talk to me. And I thought, oh, this is great. You know, this is an introductory class. I was trying to recruit for the major. I was hoping that they were going to tell me that they really appreciated my attempt to cover this important issue of sexism. Probably most of you can guess what came next. They came up to me and said, were you trying to use the class discussion as an example? And I said, what do you mean? And they said, there were two men in the class. There were, I think, 22 women, and the men did half the talking literally. So this was me. This was someone who wrote a dissertation on inequality, who has studied for decades. Admittedly, this is a few decades ago, but still. And here I was doing this exact thing in a class in which I was trying to teach about sexism. So it's in all of us. You know, we have learned it. We have breathed it in. And so this is a real thing. So if you are that woman or that member of a BIPOC community in a classroom and you see what's going on and you see that you are being thought of as less engaged, less committed, less intelligent, whatever it might be, what are you likely to do? You are likely to disengage. You are likely to go, you know, this is bullshit. You know, you are likely to salvage your dignity however you see fit, and that might mean taking your energy and attention and putting it somewhere the heck else. But if that happens, and the professor or teacher sees you disengage, you have just confirmed their stereotype that you are less engaged or less committed or less intelligent or whatever. Stereotype threat is somewhat related to this. I'm not going to talk about it, but obviously it's a real thing, and we all strive to work against it. An interesting example of this that I ran into a couple of years ago, recent book by the sociologist Jacqueline Wong, who studied dual career heterosexual couples. So these were really smart men and women who had very good educations and were equally prepared for high-powered professional jobs. And she interviewed them over several years to see what their job trajectories were like. So what happens? They get to their jobs. The men are treated well. They're given the benefit of the doubt. They move forward. They progress. They get raises. They get new opportunities. They are thought of as competent and so on. The women get into these jobs. They're treated less well. They're harassed. Opportunities are not given to them. They're kept out of networks. And over time, as these couples talked about what to do with their careers moving forward, unsurprisingly perhaps, the women began kind of falling away from those careers. Some of them had kids. Some of them moved into other jobs that were not careers. You know, they did a range of things, but it was very hard for them to stick with positions in which they were being kind of systematically badly treated. But again, when that happened, that simply confirmed their supervisor's understanding of who was really committed and who wanted to be there and who was more competent. Racism in the criminal justice system, we could talk about this in many ways, but I'll stick to one in the interests of time. So I am, as anyone who knows me knows, I'm an inveterate speeder. I received a speeding ticket in 2004 when I was driving 40 miles an hour east on Uinta. And yes, that was very bad, and I shouldn't have done it. The cop treated me very, very nicely, I will say that, and I write about this in the book. Since 2004, I calculated a few months ago that I have sped at least 20,000 times, okay? How many traffic tickets for speeding have I gotten since 2004? 0! I wish I had a prize to give you. That's right, none. So, police officers don't tend to pull over white people driving white-looking cars, you know? So, in fact, I do not wish to run drugs. I do not wish to carry contraband. I do not wish to launder money. I mean, like, that's not me. Anyone who knows me knows that. But boy, I could make a lot of money if I wanted to do it, because I would never get pulled over. I could have bags of heroin and cocaine in the back of my car, and no one would ever know. No cop would know, because they never, ever, ever pull me over. And in case you are tempted to ask whether I speed in front of cops, the answer is, of course I speed in front of cops. They still don't pull me over. Cops pull a lot of members of BIPOC communities over, and they don't tend to find a lot of contraband, but since they don't pull white people over, they still find more contraband in BIPOC cars than they do in white cars, because they don't find it in white cars because they don't pull us over. See how this is a self-fulfilling prophecy? That just then continues the idea on the part of police officers that white people are trustworthy because they never learn when and how we aren't. They assume we are not criminals because they never learn when and how we aren't. But because they occasionally get a hit when they pull a black, Hispanic, indigenous, Latinx person over and so on, that's enough for them to keep this self-fulfilling prophecy going. So more broadly, what we see here is a pair of cycles, and I'm going to embarrass Helen Daly right now by saying that she is responsible for this figure and the next figure. This is something that emerged very early in our conversations about this book, years and years ago. So what happens if people treat you in good faith, if people assume the best of you, and they give you opportunities, and they give you that mortgage loan, and they don't pull you over, and they teach energetically to you because they know you're smart enough to really learn and your learning excites them? What happens? You're going to have good outcomes. They treat you well, you're going to have good outcomes, your successes are going to be visible, those successes will reconfirm their good faith assumptions, and the cycle continues and continues and continues. Then, of course, there's the bad faith cycle, which is the reverse version of that. So this is not only about self-fulfilling prophecies, this is really a much broader understanding of how inequality works. But I find it exceedingly helpful, and I am deeply grateful to Helen for initially coming up specifically with this figure. We have one more category to continue to consider before I wrap this up, and we have some time for discussion, questions, objections, whatever. And that is the relationship between problems and people. It is astonishing to me that never in decades of reading about inequality in multiple social science disciplines have I ever quite seen this category put together in this kind of way. But I think it's an important category because it is a great example of good faith and bad faith in terms of how we use language, but then the impacts that language has. So some people, quote unquote, have problems. Some people, quote unquote, are problems. And here are just two examples of that. When students misbehave in school, especially at younger levels than we have here at Colorado College, how is that interpreted? How are they thought of and how are they treated? Well, if they are white, and perhaps especially if they're white and female, but certainly if they're white, they're more likely to have their problem defined as medical or mental health related. And so they are more likely to be sent to a counselor or perhaps to have an IEP developed for them or something like that. Whereas, you've all heard of the school to prison pipeline. What happens when students of color misbehave? They are suspended, they are expelled, and they disengage from school, and the teachers who see the misbehavior interpret it in the worst possible faith, and so on. And so a white or white female student misbehaving is in need of support, the poor thing. She's having a hard time emotionally. You know, let's get her a therapist, or let's get her an IEP or something like that, and help her out. Whereas the black kids or the Hispanic kids, Latinx kids who are misbehaving, well, you know, they're just showing that they're future criminals. And so let's expel them, let's suspend them, let's punish them. Let's start that punishment process nice and early. So that's a particularly good example. Another really good example, I bet you didn't know that drugs were racial, that drugs had racial identities, but they do. Crack cocaine is widely associated with African American people, despite the fact that, according to all the literature I've found, white people use it more than African American people, but it was very visible as a black drug in the 1990s. Powder cocaine is much more associated with white people. I went to high school in New York City in the 1980s, and I mean, half of my classmates maybe were using, I don't know, I didn't, but certainly I knew all sorts of people who were. So, crack and powder cocaine, same drug, made differently with slightly different levels of effects. But for a very long time, the amount of cocaine that you had to have on you to get to the mandatory minimum sentence was 5 grams of crack cocaine. Anyone know how many grams of powder cocaine? 500. It was literally a 100-to-1 ratio. It later got knocked down to be approximately an 18-to-1 ratio. I guess that's progress. I don't know. I'm not really a quant jock, but But seriously, and today, still most of the people who are arrested for crack use, who've been arrested for it in the past few years, it's still all members of BIPOC communities getting arrested for it. So it still is sort of culturally identified as this black and Latinx drug. Then, of course, there's how our society interacts with large-scale addiction problems. So if you think about the federal government, its interactions with the criminal justice system and the healthcare system, despite my not being a very quantitatively minded sociologist, I think that budgets help us understand what's important to people. And so it's very telling that during the crack epidemic, overwhelmingly the federal budget that was sort of put toward the crack epidemic went toward criminal justice. It was something like 75 to 80% of it. Huge amount. With the opioid addiction, which is in fact a multiracial problem, but is culturally really associated with white people and perhaps especially with rural white people, though not only, that percentage has been reversed. In recent years, the federal budget to go for that has been 75 to 80% toward healthcare and prevention, not criminal justice. Then we get to the issue of whose problem is it? So I'm going to give you 2 really different examples here. I'll try to be brief with them. When 2 people have an equal investment in making sure that a certain outcome happens, you'd think they would be equally responsible for making sure that outcome happens. And yet birth control, which arguably benefits men as well as women, is in this country overwhelmingly a female matter. Something like 90% of birth control is aimed at women. No snide comments there, but again, you'd think men do have an interest, men who have sex with women have an interest in not participating in that woman getting pregnant if that's not what the 2 of them want, and yet somehow it's her problem, it's her responsibility. Then, of course, sexual assault prevention is women's responsibility. If you look at, say, sexual assault prevention tips on college websites, or other places like that where such information is gathered, they're overwhelmingly addressed at women. Don't do this, don't do that, don't dress this way, don't drink this way, don't walk alone at this hour, don't. You know what's interestingly missing from these websites? Dear men, don't rape. I mean, literally. This is literally a case where sexual assault is 93% a male phenomenon, and yet women are responsible for keeping it from happening somehow. That tells us something about how valued men and women are in our society. And it leads us to this 3rd category of how problems and people intersect, which is the notion of blaming the victim. I don't really need to say much about rape myths. I think we've all heard them, and I think we all know that they make it much harder to hold men accountable for sexual assault because it is so easy to blame women for it, despite the fact that the women did not do it. But there are a couple of other examples that are pretty meaningful. Perhaps some of you have heard of the phrase gay panic or trans panic. This is a defense used by people who have killed gay men and trans people, and the defense basically says that person made a pass at me and it scared me, so I killed them. So, I mean, whatever you think about the made a pass part of this, basically this is a defense that blames the victim's death on their sexuality or gender identity. That is what it comes down to. Fortunately, more and more states are making this illegal, but it's pretty horrifying. Then, of course, there's all of the blaming of victims when those victims are members of BIPOC communities who have been killed by police officers or vigilantes. I'm not going to go into that, but I do want to end this with a really interesting comparison. This is also from the book, and we are now comparing Ted Bundy and Michael Brown, a case of when the killers are the good guys and the victims are the bad guys. So, who here knows who Ted Bundy was? Okay, so most of you do. This is what the media said about him right after his arrest. His mother, Louise Bundy, said there was never a shred of evidence in her son's first 28 years before he became a murder suspect for the first time to hint at any aberrant behavior. People familiar with his early years say he was a Boy Scout, a B-plus college student. He loved children, read poetry, and was a rising figure in Republican politics in Seattle. The year the murders began there, he was the assistant director of the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Commission and wrote a pamphlet for women on rape prevention. So if you didn't know anything else about Ted Bundy, he does sort of sound like a Boy Scout. I mean, literally a Boy Scout. In fact, he was eventually convicted of raping and murdering 30 women, and the odds are that he raped and murdered way more than that, but that's all they got him for. This was during the 70s for the most part. And I want you to notice something. I didn't choose to talk today about how positive and negative visibility work as a cultural form of inequality, but listen to this phrase: the year the murders began there in Seattle. Not the year Ted Bundy began raping and murdering women. The year the murders began there. Ted Bundy is invisible in that. It is a kind of positive invisibility that keeps him from being held kind of culturally accountable for what he did. So that's Ted Bundy. Michael Brown, some of us will remember from 2014. Here is what a New York Times reporter wrote about him shortly after his death. Michael Brown, 18, due to be buried on Monday, was no angel. He lived in a community that had rough patches, and he dabbled in drugs and alcohol. He had taken to rapping in recent months, producing lyrics that were by turns contemplative and vulgar. So how interesting. Ted Bundy sounds like a choir boy, despite raping and killing dozens of women. Michael Brown was no angel, despite having been brutally killed by a police officer while unarmed, and if he had committed any crime at all that led up to that, it was a pretty minor one. But nonetheless, Michael Brown's the bad guy and Ted Bundy's the good guy, and that's what we get when we have these ways of identifying certain kinds of people as problems and certain other kinds of people as having problems. So, I am going to be giving the Block 8 faculty lunch talk this year, and I'm going to come back to this book for that, and I'm going to talk about some things I have not talked about today. I just want to kind of let you know what they are. First, I'm going to spend some time in that talk on the idea of privilege. I have a lot to say about that and how this approach to inequality can help us reframe privilege as a really sociologically useful concept and not merely a set of lists of individual privileges that I have or you have or someone has. And then, of course, I'm going to talk about the final chapter at that talk and what are the implications of these ways of seeing inequality? What can we do about them? How can we make the world a little bit better? So, with all of that, I'm going to offer some gratitudes, and then we have some time for a conversation. First, I want to thank the College Events Office. Everyone in it, but the people who I knew by name when I put this together were Brenda DeSoto, Sarah Nurmi, and Kerrigan Edelman. Dustin Fife, of course, and the Tutt Library staff. Dean of the faculty, Dr. Emily Chan, Dr. Phoebe Lostro, who helped me with this PowerPoint. And many, many, many people supported this book. Some of the ones who are still at Colorado College include Dr. Liliana Carrizo, Dr. Helen Daly, Dr. Vanessa Munoz, who suffered my trying these ideas out in her classes a number of times, Dr. Dale Murphy-Geis, and Jesse Randall. So, with all of those thank yous, I also want to thank all of you for being here today. I really had no idea what to expect for turnout. I am flabbergasted, delighted, and humbled. And so now I've talked a whole lot. it's your turn. Oh, actually, that one might be on.
It's not on.
It's not? Okay.
Do you want to hold that?
Okay.
I can check. He said to use that one.
Okay. Anyone have a question that they want to be on mic for? Or comment or objection or anything? And if you don't want to be on mic, you can yell it out and I'll just repeat it. Christina.
It seems so high stakes once you talked about the mic. Two questions. I'm wondering if you can share about your motivation for writing the book. And the second question is, I'm sure there is something that couldn't get into the book. So what was left out and might be for the future?
So the motivation for writing this book, way back in 1996 or 97 when I was planning to write my sociology doctorate, I actually wanted to write what turned out eventually to be this book and to do this sort of theoretical way of thinking about inequality. And Phoebe Loester at the time said, no, don't do that. Pick an actual inequality struggle and study that. And I did that, and actually the book that came out of that, Queer Inclusion in the United Methodist Church, is fine. It's fortunately now becoming a little bit obsolete, which is great. But I never lost my interest in these ways that inequality worked. And I think for me what was really important was, as soon as I began experiencing, I don't need to hide behind that for this, as soon as I began experiencing sexism and heterosexism as a teenager, I immediately had a sort of sociological impulse to understand what was happening. It felt so wrong, it was so harmful, it really made my life much harder in kind of unnecessary ways. And that's really what got me interested in the topic. And then in college, I had this sort of wake-up moment. I think I was at an anti-racism rally, and I suddenly realized that even though the details of racism from which I benefit and the details of heterosexism from which I suffer were really different. In fact, these cultural processes were similar. I wouldn't have had the phrase cultural processes in college. We all remember college. I probably would hardly have strung 3 words together. But I did have some sense that there was something connecting these things. And it wasn't in the details of the history, but what was it? And so that kind of really led me to think about this. And then just over the years, I've read and read and read and read, and these ideas sort of came together over time. So that was part of it. And then, unfortunately, I have to say, in my own life, in a range of venues, I have seen all sorts of people being given the benefit of the doubt who I'm not convinced deserved it. And I've seen all sorts of people being denied the benefit of the doubt who really should not have been. So there's a range of stories there, but there's a lot of different fuel for this book. In terms of what's coming up next, I'm sort of inclined to make a joke and say that I'm supporting about 8 external review self-studies right now and a variety of assessment projects, and then there's the IRB, but that's not what you're talking about. So the weakest chapter in the book is the one that I was sort of forced to add late. And the problem isn't that I was forced to add it. The problem was that there was a word count limit that really made it hard for me to do it justice, which is the chapter on collusion. So it is simply true that women participate in sexism. Amy Coney Barrett, anyone? And it is absolutely true. I won't continue with actual names, but it is absolutely true that members of BIPOC communities act in ways that can contribute to racism and so on. So what is that about? And does this way of thinking about inequality help us both have some compassion and empathy for people who participate in their own oppression, and can it help us think about how to liberate us, them, whoever? And honestly, that really needs its own book. I'm probably not the best person to write it, but I'm so sad that it is such a short chapter because it really deserved more than it got. Other questions? And again, comments, thoughts, objections, anything, all welcome. Okay. Jim?
I do not want to be on my
Okay.
That is way too high stakes for me and my voice, but I'm wondering about a conversation that you and I had at one of our lovely coffees where you talked to me about a book, an author and title of which I cannot remember because I'm middle-aged, but it was, I think you were talking about in-groups and out-groups.
Oh, yeah.
And people who present, who don't fit into, who are sort of in a marginalized, like they're kind of liminal, people who don't fit into particular structures.
I don't remember what this book was. I'm so sorry. I will have to go think about that.
I wish Aaron was here because it's in his office. I know that it is, and it's on my bookshelf too, but that doesn't help. But anyway,
now you know what it's like to be a librarian. Someone walks in and says these things and wants us to go find that book for them.
That book, it was read. Yeah.
Anyway, I just wanted to ask you about it sounds to me like these valued groups and non-valued groups are very similar to sort of in-groups and out-groups. Are those sort of parallel constructions?
Sure, I think they are. And in fact, I think Robert Merton himself used in-group and out-group language in his day. I have taken up using valued and devalued because I just find it kind of more useful. It does a little more rhetorical work. But yeah, they're pretty parallel.
Before it's 5 and before anyone else needs to go, we have a present for you to celebrate this occasion and achievement. We also kind of have a non-apology. It's bigger than I expected because I wasn't probably paying attention. But we got the cover of your book framed in this beautiful image because this is a wonderful achievement. So congratulations, Amanda.
Thank you, that's really kind. Obviously anyone who needs to leave should leave whenever, and I know a few people have. If anyone does have any other thoughts or questions or anything that you want to ask in front of the whole group, now is a great time. But we have timed this so that we have the space for up to another half an hour, so I'm happy to just hang out and chat with people and answer individual questions if you really didn't want to kind of ask one on the mic. You are welcome to come up and look at the book. Again, please don't take the copies, but you're welcome to browse through it. And the library kindly also brought a copy of the other book I had published this year, which we are not talking about today. It is not entirely an academic book, though it's a pretty intellectual book. But so feel free to come up and browse, and if you want more drinks, there's some more drinks. I'm happy to talk to anyone. I am so, again, honored and humbled that you all came today.
I have a question. Would you consider, and I'll give you an example of self-fulfilling prophecy. So I grew up in New York, Jewish neighborhood, never felt discriminated against, but my mother, who's 97 and doing very well, often looked at things happening and, this happened to her because she was Jewish, even though there was nothing obvious. So is that self-fulfilling, or is that some different category of someone who's feeling discriminated against, when my observation was no, that didn't happen because of other reasons?
So that is a really interesting question, and I don't think I would put that into a self-fulfilling prophecy category, because when Merton came up with the idea, he really was thinking of large-scale social patterns more than kind of individual behaviors or individual experiences. It certainly is true that how we interpret our experiences as individuals can impact how we act in the world. That can set up kind of a small, little self-fulfilling prophecy, and those can be positive or negative. Unrelated to inequality, for example, I was recently musing over the fact that no one has ever suggested that I am not a creative person or tried to stifle my creativity. And I think the fact that I've always been encouraged to be a creative person has let me be wildly creative in writing books and essays and music and all sorts of things. And so in a sense, there's a sort of a positive self-fulfilling prophecy there. I have no sort of way to understand what really happened to your mother, and so that's not something I can weigh in on. I think what most sociologists and social psychologists who study inequality would say is, often if someone who is in a group that in fact faces systemic discrimination thinks that something that happened to them was discrimination, my default would be to believe them rather than not. Again, I can't speak to your specific circumstance, but certainly one thing I've learned in my fumbling attempts over the year to be a better ally to members of BIPOC communities is if someone comes to me and says, someone in a BIPOC community comes to me and says, this happened to me and this was racism, my job is not to say, no, it wasn't. My job is not to say, what do you mean? My job is not to say, you're being too sensitive. There's that sensitivity again. My job is to say, that was wrong. How can I advocate for you and help you work against it? So, can't talk about your mother, know nothing about it, but broadly speaking, I think we ought to err on the side of believing people.
Give her the benefit of the doubt.
Give her the benefit of the doubt. Thank you, Mark. Yeah, exactly. All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Again, happy to chat with anyone individually. And thank you so much, Dustin, and library people, and everyone else I've already thanked by name for the ways you've made this possible. You know, something I will say is, and I write this in the acknowledgments, the acknowledgments section of any book is usually the most sociological part of that book, even a sociology book, because that's where we understand that it takes a village to make a book. So thank you, village.